Hello, welcome to the second lesson of Radio 2 for production. So you would see my background is blurred this morning. Sorry about that. The reason for it is we're sitting in my studio and my studio is a little all over the place at the moment, you know, being a creative person. So I have to sort it out this afternoon, and then by all means, next time I can show you my studio. Getting on with the lesson, in the previous lesson, I gave you some homework where I asked you to go around to 5 people and ask them a couple of questions. So did you find any correlations? Were there any of the answers that were similar? Could you deduct anything from it? That was the idea behind it. Apart from that, I hope by this stage you've started listening to some radio stations, which is obviously the idea. By all means, feel free to get in contact with me. Let me know which stations you're listening to, which presenters you're listening to, why, what it is that stands out about them for you, seeing as that's the stuff that we're going to start getting into a little bit more. But we're continuing with research now. So this will be our second lesson out of 6 for research. Let me just get the slides ready for you. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at today is chapter 11 of Next Level Radio. Okay, so who is listening? Okay, so like the homework I gave you in the previous lesson, we need to know who is listening. So when we look at people as a whole, as you hopefully would have seen in your homework, there are common themes that appeal to everyone. So everyone has similar interests in certain areas. So everyone likes clean sheets, or at least I hope we all do. We all hate traffic. We all hate queuing. We all hate ads at the beginning of YouTube. We all get bored easily, okay? So as you can see, there are things that we all have in common. So radio stations need to generate interesting topics that will appeal to the majority of their listeners. It's important to remember that demographics can limit our view of segmentation and can only get us as far as understanding the mass groups of the audience. We're going to go more in detail into demographics now, but keep in mind that when we split people by demographics, it still doesn't mean that I understand in detail who they all are. So if we were to list 5 points that run across the entire class and decide to apply them with you. So if we looked at 5 songs everyone liked, the 5 most important things to you in your life, 5 reasons you get up in the morning, we'd definitely find a couple of commonalities, okay? It's these themes, these specific things that radio stations focus on as their expertise. So stories where people succeed despite the odds is a big one. That's one that stands out. We love stories with hope in it because we all like to have a little bit of hope in us, and we all like to think that despite the odds, we will succeed. And we love stories with happy ending. It's just in us, okay, as people. It's all about the interesting topics that will appeal to the majority of the audiences. So that's what it's about. When we start looking at demographics, it's important to note that data may not represent an individual's experience, okay? It's very important to understand an audience in much more detail than simply putting them in demographic groups. Radio stations need to generate interesting topics, like I've just said, that will appeal to the majority of listeners. But we also need to look at the way that we do it. So demographics equals the study of demography, which equals the study of aggregates, not individuals, which is important for us right now. Stations appeal to mass audiences by finding topics and themes that people most care about or are most concerned with, and generating a radio style that presents alternative viewpoints and develops characters that different types of audiences can identify with. Okay, so that's what it's important right here. So things that come in here, think about the breakfast show that you listen to. For instance, if I think about the 947 Breakfast Club in the mornings, they're really good at this. So if they have a topic that they're talking about, whatever it might be, they always have different viewpoints. So Anele would come in with her viewpoint, and then Tembekile would have his viewpoint on it, and Frankie would come in, and then Cindy would come in. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring in all the different elements that you could have had, all the different opinions that could have come out, they all try and bring in individually to make you feel, okay, cool, yes, that's what I think, because you might not agree with what Anele is saying, but you might agree with what Tembekile's view is on something, okay? That's what they try and do. And that is how radio stations then grab you, how they connect with you, because they're still giving you your connection through one of those viewpoints. So think about demographics again. So let's say I was classed in the 30 to 35 white female class. That would not mean that I have the same interests as someone else that's a 30 to 34-year-old white female, because I don't have any kids where a lot of them might have kids. So they'd be more interested in families and children, etc. Whereas I'm more of a working woman and I love my dogs and my cats. They might be stay-at-home moms, and there's nothing wrong with either one, but we're interested in different things. So we're going to have different things that we'd want to talk about at the end of the day, because nappies for me, for instance, is something I hate talking about. I have nothing to do with them. There's no reason for me to discuss them. Whereas I get it's very important if you have a child. So that's the kind of things where we need to get more into detail. So how do we do this? How do we actually compile the data and figure out who is listening to us, okay? Because this is demographics, great. But how do we get our listenership? In South Africa, we use RAM. So the BRC RAM. RAM is what gives us our data. So here's just a short summary of RAMs. So you'd remember from the previous lesson, we spoke about the BRC, so Broadcasting Research Council, radio audience measurement. So that's what this whole thing is. So the BRC, radio audience measurement, which is a multi-platform and intuitive survey that is respondent-friendly across all walks of South African life. This tool collects the most accurate data through a 7-day diary across different geographies, locations, languages, and socioeconomic landscapes. The BRC commissions the BRC RAM through its researchers applied TNS, which is also Kantar, which I spoke about briefly previously, and the data is released quarterly. So the data is released Feb, May, August, and November, or it's supposed to be released at that time. We haven't had any stats since March last year, which is obviously quite a problem because we're almost going on a year. But I understand that Kantar is working on the solution. So if we look at RAM, radio audience measurement, it's a tailor-made independent survey specifically designed for South African broadcasters and advertisers. For broadcasters, RAM is a useful way of understanding the audience numbers and their movements. It's also the only way that we can completely understand it in South Africa. For advertisers on the other side, it's a way of understanding where their target market is most prominent and how to make the most of their budgets and messaging. So I used to work in an advertising agency, and I understand how important these numbers are. These numbers are king. They look at these numbers for everything because, unfortunately, the clients look at the numbers. Whether you know that your numbers are actually higher or not doesn't really matter unless you have the stats to prove it. Advertising agencies, media consultants, and market research agencies usually act on behalf of advertisers or sponsors. In order to provide specialist advice to their clients, they also need detailed information on audiences for all the media. So advertising agencies always act on behalf of a client, okay? That's just how it works. So in order to provide specialist advice, they need the stats, all the information in detail to take to the client in order to tell them where to advertise, whether it be on radio, on TV, out of home, etc. Who else uses these numbers? Academic researchers and analysts use these numbers. In the end, research on media audience is necessary in order to test and develop theories on audience behavior and media consumption. So those are the three people that use these data on a day-to-day basis, would be the broadcasters, advertisers, and advertising agencies. Last but not least, the academic researchers. Okay, if we look at a little bit of history about the radio audience measurement, the South African radio listening for BRC RAM began to be collected on the 7th Jan 2016. Very specific date, I know, but it's out there, so we have it. The survey consists of two elements. The placement interview designed to collect information about the household and individuals over the age of 15. Okay, it's important they only take data from people over the age of 15. And then secondly, the radio diary, which we'll go into a bit more detail now, designed to collect radio listening for all commercial and community radio stations in South Africa for each quarter hour across a week. So you'll see now what it looks like, but you'll fill in each quarter hour what you've listened to, which station, whether it's Mhlobo Wenene, whether it's Metro, whether it's 947, but whatever it is that you were listening to, you would fill it in there. So the first industry release of data was released on the 25th of August in 2016 then, which was the Jan to June stats. So you might already pick up an issue here because we are now sitting in June 2016 and we're now getting the stats from Jan to June. So you can see it's quite a while before we get our releases. So we're never getting the actual now listenership figures. So as mentioned, the last stats that we have was from March 2020, which was, there was a 12-month rolling, but also obviously the quarterly ones. What I wanted you to see here is just the amount of people that they looked at, okay? So they're saying in South Africa, the population aged 15 plus listening to radio is 40.1 million, okay? Out of that, they do a random selection, a household flooding, which we'll talk about later, where they chose 15,173 households, which equals 61,187 individuals. And that is your sample group, okay? So out of the 40.1 million, you have 61,000 that makes up for it. So you might now be asking yourself, how do they select these households and these individuals? And how can a whole sample represent a whole population? First, you need to understand that there are sample sizes and then there's sample intervals. So a sample or a sample size refers to the number of participants in a study. Okay? The number of people that are in a study would be their sample size. A sample interval, on the other hand, is the distance between which the measurements are taken. Each household needs to be selected with a sample interval in mind. This means that a house that has been selected, let's call it house A, needs to be far enough away from house B if they're both in the sample. So the distance between these samples are based on the density of the households in a particular area, which makes sense if you think about it. So the shorter the distance, the denser the population. The longer the distance, the more space there are between two houses. So in your mind, I'm sure you can imagine that lower SEM areas will have shorter distances and higher SEM population areas will have longer distances between them. The reason for this is that they're trying to space out the area of collection so that there isn't a demographic bias. So how we select these households and these individuals is by looking at the probability proportionate to size sampling. So when looking at the households and individuals to choose for these surveys, the BRC uses an approach called probability proportionate to size sampling, so PPS. So what they do is they attribute numbers to the portion of the population over 15. Remember, I said earlier on, it's only from over 15 that they'll count you. And they take these people from small areas, which will then represent the whole population. PPS then randomly selects these numbered people living in those small areas to participate in the survey and therefore make up the sample. The small areas are classified by the South African Census Study, which classifies each area of the country that has a fixed boundary. So how can a sample represent a whole population? Obviously, it's impossible to survey every single member of the population in order to get a directly accurate idea of the listening habits of the entire country, as we are just under 60 million at this point. This is why the BRC will select a representative sample for a survey. So again, a sample is a portion or segment of the total population or research universe that is selected through a sampling scheme to represent the whole population. A sampling scheme is the way that the sample is obtained. In the case of RAM, the study takes the South African census data, as mentioned earlier, which is the largest survey of its type in the country to derive a sample for RAM. So for example, if we as a nation had a 51% female population, then the BRC needs to be sure that 51% of the RAM sample are female respondents, obviously. So in South Africa, we still make use of the paper diary methodology, which is also used in a few other countries like the UK, Australia, Finland, who else? China, India, Malaysia. So there are still a few countries that make use of this. So if you look at our RAM diary, it measures the following: which radio stations the respondent listens to on each day of the week, how long the respondent listens to each station, where the respondent was listening to the station, what device they're listening on, and their favorite radio stations. So here's an example of a paper RAM diary from 2018. This is also in your textbook on page 418. So here you can see you put in which day you're listening, the date, whether it's in the morning or the afternoon, all the quarterly hour segments you'll fill in here, where you're listening, whether it's in your house, somewhere else, on what you're listening, on your radio, on your phone. So here you will put all of that in, okay? And then if you haven't listened to it. So what I want you to do now, before we carry on going any further, is on page 419, there's activity 11A at the top of the page. Okay, I want you to make sure that you can answer these questions. So the first one, explain the role of RAM in the media industry and who could benefit from the data that is collected through RAM studies. Then name the two methods used in South Africa for collecting the RAM data. Discuss the differences between a sample and a sample interval, and list 5 key pieces of information that a radio diary is able to measure. Then if we move on and we look at this section, so this is the viewership numbers for 1 week, okay? So what happens now is once I have all this data, they will collect the diaries, collate the data, put them in a nice Excel sheet, and then the data is given back to the radio industry in the form of a BRC radio station dashboard. So I still have an example of one of these dashboards that I'll find for you quickly, as I think it's something worth seeing. Okay, so this is what the BRC RAM radio station dashboard looks like. You'll see this is an older one. It's Jan 2018 to June 2018, but this is what they'll always send out. And you'll see it's. So if we take an example here, let's take Gagazi FM. So here you'll see, here are their total audience numbers. So 1 week Q, average daily audience Monday to Friday, average daily Monday to Sunday. Here there's a breakdown for gender, age, race, how many exclusive listeners are listening, the area, the device, the language, the location, and then the SEM, socioeconomic measure, and the province that they're listening in. Okay, and here you can see the radio listening by quarter hour. So you'll see here, like in the mornings, between, what is this? Like, let's say between 9 and 11, they are most listened to. This is on a Saturday and a Sunday. And Monday to Friday, the highest point is here at 7 and here at just after 8. So what is this? Almost 9. So that's their highest listening. Okay, so this is what you can all see on this dashboard. So it's got the commercial and the PBS stations here, and then there's your highest listenership community radio stations. So now if we go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so this is pretty much what I've just shown you. I've just shown you the breakdown for what it looks like. So here's just the daily audiences. It's better. So the average daily audience, Monday to Friday, Monday to Sunday, total audience. Here is the gender breakdown and their age breakdown. Here you can see the languages, location, area, device, province, socioeconomic measure. And here you can see the times of day. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can calculate this yourselves. So how these data points are collated and what they mean can be quite confusing. I get that. So what we're going to calculate is the gross total, the net total, and the cum listenership, so that you can see how it's done. So this is just an example of a single week of data. So Monday to Sunday, number of listeners and the repeat listeners. So we'll start by working out the gross number of listeners for the week. And that would be done by simply adding each day together. So in this case, the formula would be day 1 plus day 2 plus day 3 plus day 4 plus day 5 plus day 6 plus day 7, which gives you the gross total of listeners. Okay, so that's in this case is 344. From here, we can calculate our average number of listeners. To do this, we take our net total and divide it by our range. So that's the amount of days, in this case, 7 days a week. So all you do is you take the gross number, which is, we had that at 344, and you divide it by the range, which is 7. So 344 divided by 7 is 49 gross average listeners during the week. So what we're going to do now is we're going to work out the net total. And how you do that is you take the numbers of listeners for the week and you take away all the repeat listeners. So let's say I was listening to Metro FM for 7 days a week, every day for at least a quarter hour. That means I was listening for 7 days a week on the gross numbers. But if we look at the net numbers, I'm still one person. So whether I listen for 7 days or for 1 day, it's one person, okay? So that would be the net then, 1. In this case, if we're looking at this example, we take the gross amount of listeners minus the repeat listeners, which gives us 129 total net listeners. Okay, the next thing we want to do now is we want to work out the average net, which is pretty much the same thing you've been doing with the previous one. So you take your net amount of listeners, which is 129, you divide it by the range, which is 7, and that gives you a net of 18 listeners. So now we have our gross and we have our net listeners. So our gross amount of listeners, in this case, like looking at this example over here again, and I know, I'm sorry, this is a lot of numbers, I get it, but you need to know how to work this stuff out. So gross is just plus, 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 plus. Gross average is divided by the range, so divided by 7. Net is your gross minus your repeat. Net average is then that amount that you got when you minus the gross minus the repeat, which was 129 divided again by the range, which is just 7 days, which gives you 14. The last figure we need to look at is your cumulative audience figures, okay, your cums. Again, we can't work this out if we don't have the physical diaries in front of us because we need the numbers. So the cum number is the number of people listening to a radio station for longer than 1/4 hour in 1 week, unduplicated, okay? So all that we're doing here, also very easy, straightforward. So for each day, you're going to go number of listeners minus repeat listeners, minus 25. Number of listeners minus repeat listeners, Tuesdays 2, etc., etc. Okay, Wednesday 70 minus 55, Thursday 40 minus 22, Friday 5 minus 0, etc., etc. Okay, and that gives you your cum listenership for that 1 week. So this is an example of a cumulative listener graph. This just makes it a lot easier for us to see what's going on. Bear in mind, the more quarter hours we have per person, the more these figures can change, okay? Quarter hours. Important to note, the more quarter hours we have per person, the more these figures can change because each quarter hour is counted for gross total and for gross average listenership, okay? So the more quarter hours someone listens, the more this can change because each quarter hour is counted. So what can we tell if we look at this graph? We can tell that on Tuesday and on Friday, we got the least amount of new audience members in versus on Saturday, we got the highest amount of new audience listeners in. So looking at this little block over here, the following results can be calculated using the formula that we just learned. So you can work out what the gross total listeners are, the gross average listeners are, the net total, the cum listeners, and the average listeners. Do me a favor, go and look at this and see if you can work this out. If you understand everything that was just said, all of these, if you get the same amounts. If you don't, please contact me so I can help you, so we can see where it is that you're struggling, whether it is something that I just didn't explain well enough, so that we can get you on the correct page. Phew, okay. BRC RAM diaries done and dusted. Can I just tell you that if you walk into a radio station and you ask them to explain to you how a radio diary works, very few people are going to be able to explain that to you, okay? So it's an important section to start understanding, and it will give you a foothold if you can understand it. Just something that I've pulled again from the BRC's website, just a couple of FAQs. So frequently asked questions, just to make sure that you are, so this is kind of a summary, I guess. So how are the BSc RAMs conducted? It's conducted through a placement questionnaire and a 7-day self-completion diary. These self-completion diary. All the interviews are done face-to-face, which is why currently we can't be doing them, and which is why our RAMs are so far behind, because obviously with COVID, no one can go in, okay? Why are they paper-based? Because in South Africa, we have different, because in South Africa, it was deemed the best suited. As we have different education levels, different literacy, different types of devices in the household. Not everyone has access to smartphones to be able to do it the way that, for instance, the USA does it, okay? So the paper-based survey in South Africa is still seen as the best measurement. So how do they decide who to include in these surveys? All the stations that are on ICASA's list, all the AM and FM stations are on the survey. The only ones that are not on there are the online streaming radio stations, which is something that is on the establishment survey and that they're looking at adding when it becomes more prevalent in South Africa. And then, as mentioned, you have to be over 15 to be able to take part in the sample, and that's the average households that they look at. And as mentioned, there's about 61,000 people, that's individuals rather, that form part of this sample study, everyone aged 15 plus. The samples are drawn by using the probability proportionate to size sampling, so the PPS, to identify each small area where the interviews will be conducted. And no, the samples, unfortunately, are disproportionate in that there's a higher allocation of metro areas than there are to the smaller areas. And then something that always comes up is, are the sample sizes proportionate? No, the sample size is disproportionate in that there is a higher allocation of metro areas, and this is something that community and campus radio stations always tend to bring up. And that brings us to the end of this lesson. I'm sorry, I realized this was a very intensive lesson. There's a lot of information in this lesson that you need to take in. So I encourage you to please go through this again. If you have questions, please let me know so I can assist you and help you through this, okay? It's important for me that you understand everything in detail that was going on. So we've already worked through the questions we've already worked through page 419 11A's questions, which I hope that you have answered. If you haven't already answered it for yourself, please do so. And then the other thing I want you to look at is on page 425. It's a short section on BRC. Just read through it. It's all just putting all the information together and making sure you know 100% what's going on as we move into the next lesson of research. So that's the end of this one.